Well, good evening. I'm Charles Schultz, and this is the Randomizer. And happy Friday to everybody. Tonight we're going to have the term bandwidth. Everybody thinks they know what it is. Very few people actually do. Bandwidth is often referred to in terms of communication. It's an old word that's been around a very long time, starting with audio and radio broadcasting, and it has persisted for many years because it has a lot of uses. Bandwidth, as we know, seems to be tied to the speed of communication, and that's a pretty good guess. But we're going to get into the details of bandwidth here very shortly. So let's see what's going on here. Wow, Schultz Laboratories, yes, and Universe Science Center. We're expanding our number of rooms, galleries, and exhibits, and we need people like you to become a member and help support our efforts to expand what we're doing and offering to the community, the people who wish to learn from us. So go to universesciencecenter.com or schultzlaboratories.com, click through the page, and become a member. That's greatly helpful to us, and I think that when you see what we're offering, you're going to be pretty impressed with it and want to be a supporter and a user of the site as well. There are many things to learn there. We're adding more in computing, in planetary science, in physics, electronics, and many other fields, and it's going to be a wonderful resource overall. So also every weekday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have the randomizer, as you know. Join us live by going to the site, clicking through, and joining. And when you get there a little before 6, it will automatically conduct you to the page. Bring your questions, your answers, your suggestions, anything you wish to say, and join us live during the randomizer. Monday evenings, we're going to be starting our robotics classes pretty soon, and we're going to also have classes live here in our Schultz Laboratories facility in Lanark Village, Florida. So go online, look at the posted notifications, the schedule, and see what it is that you have the opportunity to come here, participate with hands-on, learn from us, and participate. Build your own robot. I think it'll be a lot of fun. You'll learn a lot. So let's get on to the subject matter at hand, bandwidth. Now, everybody has an internet connection, and we often refer to the bandwidth of your connection. And people say, well, the bandwidth is being used, too many people are on the channel. That's fairly close. Bandwidth originally, of course, started way back in the audio days and in the radio broadcasting days when voice signals were sent out. And so we really have a number of different types of radio transmission. Everybody is sort of AM and FM. AM is a type of radio transmission where the amplitude or height of the signal carries the information. You have a constant tone, more or less, at one frequency, and the amplitude of that frequency goes up and down, and that carries the voice signal, the modulation. So AM is amplitude modulation, literally the height of the signal. The only problem with AM is it tends to be noise sensitive and it doesn't have a great range. Then along comes FM. FM is frequency modulation and it's a much more robust system. In frequency modulation, the voltage of the signal created by your voice literally changes the frequency of the wave you're broadcasting. And so the frequency shifts up and down around some central frequency or channel, and your radio decodes that back into an audio signal. This is much more robust, as I said. It also is much less sensitive to noise. So you can drive quite a distance from an FM station and the signal remains clear because you're not listening to the height of the wave, you're listening to the frequency shift of the wave. The difference with FM is when it starts to drop out, it gets choppy. It doesn't just fade away into quiet, it begins chopping in and out. So there are some differences. There are other sorts of modulation as well. Pulse code modulation. There are many ways of modulating or altering a radio wave so that it can carry some sort of information. And this is what it all comes down to, carrying information. And it doesn't matter if it's an audio signal or a video signal or a digital signal or what. Now, we also talk about narrowband and wideband signals. Well, bandwidth obviously has some meaning. What is a band? Really, this is a channel in radio parlance. You have somewhere along this range of frequencies a particular frequency that you are going to call your home frequency, let's say. And so FM radio, for instance, runs from 87.5 to 108 megahertz in the US. It's similar in some countries, totally different in others. But just for the US, we're going to refer to the set of frequencies we use here. So what is it that often you may have wondered, why is it that an FM radio station always ends in an odd number? You're listening to 97.5 or 88.3 or whatever. Well, here's the deal. That odd number is the center of the channel. And the channel is allowed to spend 200 kilohertz on its signal. It has a bandwidth of 200 kilohertz. So your signals will be centered on that odd number and will go up and down 100 kilohertz from there. So 87.5 has the frequency slot of 87.4 megahertz to 87.6 megahertz, and it stays in the center of the channel. So your bandwidth is 200 kilohertz for that FM channel. Well, you're thinking, well, it doesn't take 200 kilohertz to make an audio signal. No, it doesn't. But understand that if you were to analyze the channel, you will see that there is a mono channel in there. There is a left audio channel, a right audio channel. Each of those is 15 kilohertz. There's a 19 kilohertz pilot tone for your stereo. And that is the reference that your radio uses to know where to start decoding the left and the right channel from. So there's some markers, signals, other content in there, and overall they can spend up to 200 kilohertz on their channel. Now, as I was stating, an audio signal in there has a bandwidth of only 15 kilohertz. And why is that? The human range of hearing extends typically from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. But for most people, particularly when they get older, that high frequency end drops down a little. And it isn't necessary to have all that extra overhead 5 kilohertz in order to hear a decent music signal. So 15 kilohertz is denoted and set aside for the left channel, 15 kilohertz set aside for the right channel. This is a total of 30 kilohertz, and it gives you a good audio for each ear. There are many reasons for what they do, but there's also a digital information channel written into most FM radio signals. And if you look on the newer radios, it's a display, and it says the name of the artist, the name of the piece, what it's about. So you get some digital information broadcast in there as well. So you've got a whole lot of slots inside that 200 kilohertz channel, 200 kilohertz again being your bandwidth, and that allows you to put a lot of information in there. On other channels that are not broadband, such as a narrowband channel basically, let me think of this through. The best way of saying it is, when you talk about broadband, it would be a signal like 5G or 4G, Internet of Things information, video channels, conferencing, network phones, all of those are wideband signals, and they typically take around a megahertz or more. Narrowband signals are usually 100 kilohertz or less. Now, what's the big difference? Well, basically, imagine you had a single tone that you were allowed to send somebody a signal, like a Morse code channel. So the question is, how many bits of data could you send per second? Well, it depends on the frequency of the tone, because if the tone is, let's say, a 400 hertz tone, and you turn it on and off at 100 hertz, then you have to have 4 cycles in there for each on-off cycle. So you have to have at least a couple cycles in order to recognize the tone. So you can see that there's a limit to how many times you can switch that 400 hertz on and off and still recognize it as being 400 hertz. So there is the limit. There's your bandwidth. Your bandwidth will choke the amount of data that you can send on that channel. If you're sending a 1 kilohertz tone, you might be able to switch it on and off 500 times on, 500 times off, and you might be able to get enough information in there that you'd recognize and lock onto the signal. But typically it takes 2 to 3 cycles to lock onto the signal. And a cycle is one of those wavelengths from 0 to the bottom, to the 0, to the top, to the 0 again. One complete cycle or turn of the wheel, so to speak, is recognized as a single hertz, one cycle. So for a 1 kilohertz channel, you have the opportunity to send maybe 1,000 bits of data, but tricky, and it really depends on how you modulate it. For narrowband signals, we usually see them dedicated to things like small point-to-point communications, garage door openers, little remote control devices or low rate data signals. If you want to do something ambitious like send a video signal, you're going to need at least a megahertz just to get a decent signal through, and generally more. So to supplement this, how do we get around the bandwidth issue? One of the ways when you realize you're running out of bandwidth and you can't get any more data moving is you encrypt or compress your data. So you have a certain set of a table of meanings, and you create little short tokens that represent them, symbols, and you'll send those symbols. One of the cleverer things that is around is to take, let's say, a sample of text and to say, now what letters do we use the most in that text? And they derive a symbol set of the most commonly used letters. And then they use the smallest number of bits they can to represent those letters, maybe 3 bits per letter. And then the first 7 of those characters can be done in just 3 bits. But then after that, there's like a punctuation code that says, hang on, we're going to send some longer characters. So you make up a table of the shortest and the most commonly used because they can be sent fastest. And then the ones that you don't use as much are a little bit longer, and the ones you don't use very much at all can be considerably longer. So you will analyze your message, you will compress it all down into this compression table, and then at the beginning of your message, you'll send the compression table, which is like a decoding key. And then a whole slug of information will follow it that's in a compressed format. When you get a zip file, it does something very much like this. And it allows you to knock off sometimes 30 to 50% of your data, sometimes more. But often there are some trade-offs in there. And it can be that in the string of the message, a couple of messed up bits will totally hose the rest of it. You'll lose your place and you won't be able to tell what was being sent. So they invented a new thing, Hamming code, error correction codes. And what this allows you to do is frame your data so it's a little bit longer, but there's a signature block in there that says, hey, if it didn't come out this way, sum up to this known signature, there's an error and we'll resend. So getting around bandwidth is one of those things that has forced people to make new methods of encoding and encrypting and compressing information. Compressed information can be sent very quickly. And if that's true and you make a mistake, well, then you just resend it again. It didn't eat a whole lot of bandwidth. But one of the things that we really think of the most when we speak about bandwidth is the internet. And of course, that's because the internet uses a huge amount of data all the time. We're sending things like dynamic, like movies and conference calls with 10 participants and a lot of video and audio flying around. So we use all of these compression tricks, a frame by frame basis many times, to cram as much information in there as we possibly can. And you may notice sometimes when you're watching a video online, it'll explode into colored flashing squares, and then in a few frames, it'll erase all of that and reset itself. Well, in many video streams, there are key frames that are used as references, and those are the ones that are fat with data. But once you get them, you've got an absolute known starting point. And then the frames after that send not a whole frame, but the differences from frame to frame, which could be a much smaller amount of information. And it's a very clever method of encrypting or compressing video. Bandwidth. I guess the more common way of saying this would be in audio or analog terms, it's a range of frequencies within a given band, and that's what you'd see in the old analog days or the radio communication days. In the digital age, it would be the maximum amount of data that you can transmit over, let's say, an internet connection in a given period of time. And so bandwidth has a very different meaning there, because sometimes you can send an awful lot of data over a channel, but some of it doesn't make it through. the error correction thing that I was talking about. So bandwidth isn't the frequency of the data coming through, it's the amount of data that you can get through in a unit of time. That's probably the clearest way of putting it. And yes, every time you have another participant using your internet channel, they use some of the bandwidth as well, and there's only so much available. Typically, if you're going to do a lot of gaming, video streaming, high usage stuff, you'll want an internet connection that gives you about 25 megabits per second or more. If you're going to go with lower end stuff where you're not really image and data intensive, a lot of hookups will go anywhere from 4 to 25 megabits per second. So that gives you kind of a reference. And if you do a speed test, you can go online and do internet speed tests, put it right in your browser search bar, and it'll come back with a means of seeing just how quickly you can send data and receive data. And notice one very interesting thing. The rate at which you receive data is generally higher than the rate at which you're allowed to send data. Usually this is because people didn't expect that you'd be sending as much as we do seem to do these days. And so that channel is usually throttled down a little because otherwise so many people would be online at a certain time and you simply couldn't communicate. There's a limit, after all, that will go over even a glass fiber. And by the way, if you're somebody who likes to add things to your home network system, one of the best ways to get good throughput in your home is to go with fiber optics. You can generally get fiber optic converters, and what they will do, they will take, it's kind of called a media converter, for instance. It will take an Ethernet type signal and convert it to an optical signal, and you can send a gigabit per second over an optical fiber. Normally you have two fibers, one to transmit and one to receive. On the receiving end, that gigabit of data coming in will be converted back to an Ethernet type signal, and you can plug in something that has a lot of ports on it, and you can route all the ports to different devices, and at the end it acts like a funnel. So 15 devices out here funneled together into one optical channel going over somewhere else, one optical channel coming back, splitting it back out of those 15 devices. A lot of network managers will know this is a very crude way of explaining this setup, but that's basically what happens. So if you want to have a good network at home and you're still limited to what you can get up and down the street, if you have any sort of computer network at home, you can easily go to optical signals. But the optical trunk is basically really good if you have, let's say, a lot of video internet type security cameras, net cams. And then it'll allow you to crunch a whole lot of data and get it back and forth over your network very easily. By the way, a home network doesn't have to be hooked to the internet. Your best security is to be isolated. So anybody who has any idea about security will recognize that if they have a net video hookup, it's possible sometimes for some people to hack into that and see what's going on in your net. You don't want that to happen. Anyway, bandwidth. It's all about how rapidly you can communicate. And how do we get around those limits? You can add another channel or you can compress your data. Of course, when you look out into space, we see that satellite communication generally uses some pretty fixed bandwidths, some of them pretty broad, wide band, because they usually have to conduct an awful lot of data from one point to another around the globe. Satellites, let me tell you something. We have fiber optic and cabled this entire planet into a mess. And so sometimes the only way to get a signal around is go by satellite. And many of those optical cables go to satellites. But the problem is this. On the ground, the Earth has only a radius of less than 8,000 miles. So it's about 25,000 miles around from any point. So if you had to go halfway around the world and it was a direct route, 12,500 miles. Okay. But if you're going to send a signal into space, it has to go to an orbital height to a geosync satellite, usually 22,000 miles above the planet, and then carried to another satellite in orbit, some monstrous distance, and then back down to the globe somewhere else. So you're going to be talking 60, 80, 100,000 miles for your signal to travel, perhaps, when if you go through a cable or a network on the ground, 10, 15,000 miles. So there are delays in satellite communication as a result. And this means for a lot of military or sensitive applications, they have to send somebody on the spot to be there to do sensitive communication because the time delay is so great that remotely controlling a lot of that stuff just would not work. So something interesting to think about. Well, anyway, the floor is open for questions, and anybody is allowed to submit them when we are listening. And meanwhile, I do encourage you to go to schultzlaboratories.com or universeciencecenter.com, join us, and go live with us and talk with us. And it'll be a lot of fun. We'll answer your questions. We'll do the best we can. Now I'm going to read my quote. This will lead you into the weekend nicely. How much better to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding is to be chosen rather than silver. And that's Proverbs 16:16. I'll tell you, I would take the information, the knowledge, and the wisdom anytime because you can always turn that into a profit if you have any sense about you at all. So, well, thank you for joining us tonight. I have enjoyed the talk about bandwidth, and if you have questions, please do contact us, submit them. We'll read them live on the air, or you can just ask yourself. We'll have you on live audio. Meanwhile, try to enjoy your life, do the right thing, and as always, make the world a better place. I'm Charles Schultz with the Randomizer, and we'll talk to you next time. Have a great night.